Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV 18 special. I'm Shereen Bhan and we're coming to you live from Davos 2020. This is our first big event that we kick off our coverage with in association with the Confederation of Indian Industry. Davos is really about getting global business leaders, political leaders and civil society to talk about issues that concern the world. This time around, there's a lot of conversation around climate change, there's a lot of conversation around stakeholder capitalism and, of course, global trade and investment. Multilateralism is an issue that is being talked about here, but multilateralism, perhaps like globalization, facing a tough time, both in retreat. What can be done to salvage the situation is something that global CEOs are discussing. This is also an opportunity for governments to reach out to investors, and India has been doing just that for the last many years. In the past, we've had former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh here in Davos, and we've also had Prime Minister Modi here attending the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, pitching the India story to global investors and to other leaders as well. So today, to kick off our Davos 2020 coverage, we're going to talk about the potential of India as an innovation and investment destination. It continues to be one of the world's fastest growing economies, despite the fact that at this point in time, there is a slowdown that the Indian economy is faced with. Outside of traditional businesses, what we are seeing is a lot of enthusiasm in India's startup ecosystem. In fact, just to give you some numbers and some perspective on the way that that side of the economy has grown, about $550 million were raised by Indian startups in 2010, and for 2019, that number stands at $14.5 billion. So there is upside, there is potential. There are, of course, deficits that need to be addressed, both in terms of policy, and one of the big questions, though, is can technology be the lever that can be used to bridge some of those crucial deficits, for instance, in healthcare and education. So let me kick things off. This is going to be an interactive conversational session. Let me go across to Rama, the Industry and Technology Minister from the state of Telangana. So as I pointed out, states here also pitching their story. So you've got a little bit of the federal competition going on here in Davos. What's the case for India that you're making?
Well, firstly, thanks, Shereen, for doing this. Really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to Government of India as well for co-hosting this event. India is one of the most compelling business stories I think the world has come to start believing in, and the world has come to start looking at it in the right light. Few factors that really work well for us. One of the things, of course, is the whole engine room population or engine room segment, which is about 40% of the youth between the age of 20 and 40, is a huge advantage which India has, which I think no other country at this point of time possibly can look at or talk about.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think the way innovation as an ecosystem is emerging in India is also extremely promising. We've had some brilliant unicorns come up in even the most unlikeliest of locations in India, and just the way all these enterprises, because to quote John Chambers, who I had met last time here, he said the next million or the next couple of million jobs are not going to come from the Fortune 500, with all due respect to the Fortune 500 companies in the room. The next millions of jobs are going to come from this next wave, which will emanate from the startup ecosystem. And so I think India has a huge advantage, which I believe this government, both in Delhi and also in Hyderabad, in the form of our government in Telangana, are going to leverage.
One very quick follow-up question, and then I'll go across to the DPIIT Secretary, Mr. Mahapatra. You spoke of how the government in Telangana is going to work with the government at the center. One of the concerns that investors have is that while there might be policy, execution happens at the level of the state, and that is where they face challenges, because licenses have to be given out at the level of the state government, municipal organizations, and so on and so forth. What can be done to ensure that there is a greater degree of predictability, because the experience has been patchy?
Well, three things. In fact, firstly, like you said, we all operate under the larger rubric of India. Of course, Government of India being a very supportive government in Delhi, we appreciate what they've done for us. I think three things that really work from a state perspective, because while the larger policy decisions are made in Delhi, the action is in the states. That's a fact. Three things I am focusing on, and Telangana is focusing on personally, ease of doing business. We are number one in India.
Yeah.
And most importantly, the cost of doing business has to be lowered. And the quality of doing business has to be improved. So these three aspects bundled together. When I say quality of business, I mean the quality of talent, the quality of human resources, the quality of infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer, and I've said this to Prime Minister Modi as well, I'm a firm believer in the 3I mantra. If India has to really propel itself into greatness, innovation, infrastructure, inclusive growth. I think these 3 I's put together is what is going to help our states emerge stronger, and obviously the stronger the states, stronger the nation. So therefore, we've been working very, very closely with DPIIT and Mr. Goel and his entire team, and Mr. Mohapatra, of course. We're thankful to them for their support, but I think a lot more needs to be done on the infrastructure space.
Right.
And while states continue to lead on innovation, I think infrastructure is where Government of India can come to our rescue. And, they talked about 102 lakh crores of rupees.
Yes.
So I'm hoping Telangana will get a big chunk of that.
Everyone is hoping that they'll get a big chunk of that. But let me come to the DPIIT Secretary. As Mr. Rama pointed out, a lot more needs to be done. The question that I'm asking you is, in terms of future action, in terms of follow-up action to the reforms that have already been announced, what specifically are you going to be telling investors here? There's been a lot of speculation on the fact that outside of the corporate tax reduction that's happened, FDI and contract manufacturing that's been announced, that the government will provide further incentives to draw in manufacturing to India. What should we expect?
Thanks, Shereen. Honorable Minister of Industries from Telangana described the Indian scenery quite well. I must say that what we are trying in Government of India is to firstly ramp up our infrastructure spending. And you have heard that Honorable Prime Minister announcement about that figure, and this will obviously go to the states, because states is where the land is and states where the action is. Secondly, we are going to further strengthen the startup ecosystem in the country. We will try to bring more incentives for them. We will ensure that their credit needs are satisfied in a reasonably cost-effective manner. We are going to give them more R&D incentives, more tax incentives, so that startup preoccupation of Government of India as well as the states is going to continue and further improve. Secondly, as far as investment is concerned, we are going to do a very strong kind of hand-holding with the potential investors who come to India, not only in terms of bringing all the Government of India regulatory departments at one place, and also to bring the states along with, give them all the information online, so that if he wants to go to Telangana, right from where he is in the world, he comes to know which site is available in Telangana, what are the downward and forward linkages available for that. So a lot of things will see investor certainty.
How many state governments have come on board for this plan?
Almost all state governments have come on board, and we have several rounds of meetings, and we are planning to further strengthen the investment framework that we have in terms of perfect handholding for the potential investors who like to come to the country.
Okay.
Not only Indian, but also the foreign investors.
Quick follow-up question. The e-commerce policy, is it on the anvil? And the new industrial policy, when are we likely to see it?
Both are on the anvil, both are under consideration. The e-commerce policy is slightly linked up to the data protection bill, which is now under the consideration of the select committee of the parliament. And we expect very soon we'll finalize. And as far as the industrial policy is concerned, it's not exactly an industrial policy in that way. It is basically to trigger and identify those factors which will propel us faster towards the $5 trillion economy target that the country has set for itself.
Okay. I'll get to those specifics in just a second, but let me get other panelists in on the conversation as well. Mr. Arun Kumar of KPMG. Sir, you've been speaking with global CEOs who are looking at India as a potential investment opportunity, fresh investments as well as incremental investments. In light of what Mr. Mohapatra and Mr. Rama Rao are saying, what is the big takeaway that you get from CEOs?
Yeah, I think at the moment, every major global corporation has to have operations in India, either supporting the Indian market or using Indian talent for global use. We're just seeing an incredible increase in that. There is no let-up in pace. For instance, just to take the case where Indian talent is used globally, there are something like 1,600 global captive centers where large companies have set up operations in India to support globally. And this is not low-end work. This is increasingly high-end work. It's analytics and so forth using AI. So we're seeing that going on, and I don't think any serious corporation that has an eye on the long run can ignore the opportunity in India.
Yes, I don't think that they can ignore the opportunity. So let me go across to Vishal, who represents Hewlett-Packard here. Vishal, HP has been a long committed investor in India. And to the point that Mr. Arun Kumar was making, for technology companies, India is no longer just a back office. It is an innovation hub. IBM, Microsoft, Cisco, everyone has their largest employee bases outside of their home territories in India. How do you see that progressing from here on? And B, what do you see the role of technology in being able to address some of these deficits that we just discussed?
No, thank you, Shereen. So the way we look at India is through different lenses, right? One, as you mentioned, at HP, we've had a very long-standing relationship with India, going back many, many decades. It all started off with, to your point, leveraging India as a back office hub. But it's completely changed over the last 5 or 6 years. It's not just an innovation hub for us, it's one of our largest markets, right? So we have a huge presence in India. It's one of our fastest growing markets, actually. So we are in India not just for the innovation, the processing that we do, but as a market, it's where we are investing a lot of money. We are actually in the middle of making an investment from a manufacturing perspective right now. And so it's, again, so we are making the investments. We think there's a huge upside over time. Of course, there are challenges with any new market as you kind of, set up manufacturing, set up a footprint there. But I think there are all surmountable challenges, right? But the way we think about the market is there will be lots of growth over the next 5 to 10 years. We are in it for the long term. We are going to be investing in the market. It is actually our fastest growing geography from a sales perspective. Okay. So it's all good.
So when you say it's the fastest growing geography, give us a sense of the kind of revenue contribution that India provides at this point in time to global revenues and where you see that over the next few years.
Yeah, it's amongst the top 5 geographies for us. Big double-digit growth happening in India, and we are seeing more and more adoption of our technologies in India. The different private sector as well as the government is adopting our technologies at a faster rate. So again, lots of upside from us as we see it as a company, the country itself. So, and from an employee base, it's actually, we are slightly different. India is actually our largest employee hub, even outside of even including the US. So it is our largest country in a way, if you think about it from an employee perspective. So big economy for us, big footprint for us, and a huge upside, and we are very, very excited about the opportunities there.
Well, that's good to hear. Tiger, let me come across to you now and give us a sense of what Genpact has planned and how you see the India story shaping itself in 2020 and beyond.
So, Shereen, first of all, thank you for having me here. I was just going to take off from where Vishal said. For us, India still is the largest talent pool for us, accounts for more than 55% of our total talent pool. And Telangana is one of the 2 that compete with each other between the National Capital Region and Telangana in terms of being number 1.
And that helps you, right? Doesn't it?
It helps a lot because the talent pool in Telangana, sir, is outstanding. I would revert the dialogue into the leverage of the talent pool and getting the talent pool ready for global markets, as well as serving the Indian economy. And I'll take the conversation to an extreme on technology, and let's go to AI and machine learning. Yeah. Our perspective is people talk about AI and machine learning destroying jobs and automating and so on. The perspective we have is that AI and machine learning really finally have an opportunity to take education, healthcare, and finance to 1 billion people at a cost structure that allows all the 1 billion people to access, irrespective of where you are and irrespective of the amount you want to access. For example, I talk about this. If you want to deposit 1 rupee in your bank account every day, you can do it. It wasn't possible because it's too expensive to do it in the world of yesterday. Yeah. So what does that mean? It means there's a real opportunity to use that technology to actually educate 1 billion people without having to depend on traditional education. That's an unlocking of talent for the world. I think we need to do it. If we don't do it, I think we are missing a big game, and that has to come from the startup ecosystem.
I'll get the startup ecosystem's perspective in just a second, but to the point that you made, Tiger, and I think it's something that resonates with everyone here on this table as well. We keep talking about this demographic advantage that India enjoys, but the fact of the matter is that upskilling is a challenge. Yeah. It's not just an India challenge, it's a global challenge as well. Where is the money going to come from? Do we need to see public and private partnership really address the upskilling challenge? Because that is going to be critical for a country like ours.
I think we're beginning to see, at least I'm beginning to see, the startup ecosystem attack upskilling it is possible to use those types of technologies driven by startups who obviously have a financial motivation, but the cost structures are so low that you can actually use it to upskill a whole large set of people in primary school, middle school, without necessarily having to depend on an infrastructure of schools and buildings and teachers. Yeah. So somehow we must get together between industry, government, etc., and unlock that, create a narrative that people jump onto, and allow people to access both capital as well as leaders to actually start those ecosystems. And in the end, they may not be unicorns, but they'll be acquired by other global companies.
Yeah, I think the obsession with unicorns is perhaps a little misplaced. But since we're talking about unicorns, let me go across to Nikhil. He runs a unicorn in India, Zerodha. Thanks very much, Nikhil, for joining us. You've been listening to what the legacy businesses have to say. As a startup entrepreneur, what is the ask from the government, and how do you see the world shaping in 2020?
Hi, thank you, Shereen. As a startup, I think what we need is faster regulation. I think a lot of the regulation in India is still backward-looking, especially in the fintech and finance space. Say, for a company which wants to get into banking, the kind of rules set in place right now for banking are not very conducive to a new startup entering the industry. I think that's one of the changes that we need. And from the startup ecosystem for 2020, I think it's a year of consolidation. We see that even in our space, like traditional industries have over the last decade. And I think the number of startups will reduce, but the quality of startups are set to increase.
Well, speaking of consolidation, we've seen a deal being announced today. Zomato and Uber Eats have done a deal in India. So you're right about consolidation. But Nikhil, a bank, is that the aspiration going forward?
At some level, yeah. I think banking is a space which has not transformed in the last decade. I think there's plenty of room for innovation in banking. Yeah. And I see no reason why it should not be open to more players coming into the industry.
Okay. Since we're talking about financial services, let me get a point of view from Tech Mahindra, because you deal with a lot of the BFSI clients. What do you see as the changes that this industry is going to have to deal with? We're already seeing a fair degree of disruption, but from an India context, from what we just heard Nikhil say, what's the kind of changes that you anticipate and how technology can in fact enable those?
I think Tiger did mention about it. It's the cost of transaction coming down and making sure that the banking is available to everybody. And that's where we see a technology coming in a big way and how to transform that. If you were to flip a bit on the earlier thing that you made about the government, if I may.
Yes.
We spoke a lot about what the government is doing, what can they do more. Yeah. And I would rather flip it the other way around. I mean, I live in London, so I've seen the government there do a lot. And I think the governments here do much more than what happens in the Western world. My question is, what are we doing about it?
Yes.
I mean, we can't always say government has to do this and that.
I agree with you, by the way.
And I come from a state called Kerala. And I mean, the government is doing a lot, but I can call two individuals. One is a guy called Tony Thomas. Tony Thomas has made Kerala the innovation hub for Nissan. Yeah. I mean, there is another guy who was here, gentleman who was here, Lulu, Yusuf Ali. Yes. He's made Kerala into a powerhouse. So what we are doing, and coming to startups, I don't think they have short of money. They are not short of ideas. What they lack, I believe, is access to global markets. Okay. And that's what we are trying to bring. When customers used to come to us earlier, they used to see our facilities, spend time with our teams, explain their vision. Today they say, can you take us to the startups? Yeah. So we have a startup day for our customers. Okay. So in Telangana, obviously we owe Telangana a lot because we live in your house. So yeah, so that's what we would say.
Okay, I like that, the thought of the industry actually helping the startup ecosystem, and we do need to see much more of that collaboration. But Blake Moretta, the global CEO of Rockwell Automation with us, again, a long-term India investor. You've been there for over 2 decades now. How do you see the market shaping? How has it changed over the last few years? And what would your expectation be now?
Well, we're enthusiastic investors in India. I was just there and particularly excited with the opportunities for bringing new talent, not only to play in the Indian market, but for our worldwide operations. India is a very large employer for our worldwide population of employees, and as infrastructure continues to accelerate, we see it as an important market, but also as an important source of talent. We just completed an acquisition of a software delivery company in Pune, and we see more investment coming and accelerating.
Do you see more acquisitions, or are you done for now?
We have a healthy pipeline. I won't speculate on the very near future, but it's an important area for us to invest organically as well as in acquisitions, as well as, very importantly, developing partners throughout the country.
Yes, developing partners is something that you very rightly mentioned is going to be important. Vikram Kirloskar, there's been a lot of conversation around technology and the services side. Let's focus a little bit on manufacturing. And the hope is that there will be a dislocation of manufacturing from China to India. Though at this point in time, and I pay attention to a PwC survey, annual survey of CEOs that they do, which basically said that the US continues to be the #1 destination for global CEOs as an investment destination, China at #2, India coming in at #4. What more needs to be done to draw in the manufacturing investments?
The other day I spoke at a function with students on this, and I said, as far as I've been in manufacturing all my life, working life, 40 years, it's really a can-do attitude. And we are going through a change, I believe, in India, a structural change in the way people are buying products that we manufacture. They're looking at a far higher quality because of the media, of course, and the internet. They can see what's available around the world. They see prices available around the world, and they say, why are Indian products more expensive? I think that's one of the big structural problems we have to turn around and get our manufacturing at a global competitive level. From CI, I'm the president of CI, we've been working hard on this, that how do we convince people and how do we teach people how to make our manufacturing more competitive?
So what are the tangible steps that need to be undertaken both by industry as well as by the government?
Well, typically, I don't want to say so much on the government. The only issue.
Let's talk about industry.
Yeah, I'll talk about industry, what we can do. One is we have to invest more in innovation and R&D, and it's
without tax breaks.
Without tax breaks, yes. But I think the direction of corporate tax going down, I'd rather have that, and that's what we've suggested, that you take the tax down. We've again suggested further, take it down with no exemptions. That's an easier way to do business, I feel. But we have to continuously invest in innovation and R&D. Although our R&D investments look low in terms of numbers, about 90 odd billion for the year, I think our cost of investing in R&D in manufacturing companies is relatively less than the rest of the world. We do have an advantage there. On innovation, especially manufacturing-wide, we are not talking of highly educated people, but you've got to understand in India, not everyone gets an opportunity to go to a super school or a super college. So I think it's up to businesses and industry, again, to reskill the people that we have and use the talent that they have, they've learned in their work, in their daily lives. One of the things, there's Mr. Professor Govind Raj Viji, I think he's written a very nice book on reverse innovation. And he's talked about the Indian requirements of perhaps low-cost medical, etc., which has resulted in a huge amount of product innovation. So we have that kind of reverse innovation in products, but also in factories you'll find more and more a lot of innovation in processes. In our case, we are focusing very hard on reducing our carbon footprint. So we have low energy automation rather than low cost automation. Reduce water, reduce all kinds of resources. And that innovation is coming, again, not out of some super engineering, but out of reskilling people, reskilling the workforce. So I feel we are going through a structural change. I think you see companies, we talked about India slowing down. Yes, there is certain slowdown, but there are people who are doing extremely well as at the same time.
Yes, there are people who are beating that trend as well, and especially people who are addressing the global markets and not just the domestic markets who've been the outliers. Let me get in Sukleen here from Reckitt Benckiser. Since we're talking about frugal innovation and innovation that India can perhaps also export to the world, give us a sense of how a company like Reckitt Benckiser has done that in India.
I think, Shereen, it's also a space like people mentioned. There's a lot of learning for large corporates as well to recognize that innovation's happening in every nook and corner, but how do you really make it easier to acquire or even learn? So at this point of time, I think from the organizational view, we're starting to engage a lot more with incubators to even learn on what is happening, because it helps us save time, helps us save resources, and this engagement also allows us to learn a lot faster than actually co-creating everything on our own. So in that regard, I think the learning curve has begun. That's really where we've started engaging with universities, especially the accelerators, to learn.
That's an interesting point. We do need to see much more collaboration between academia and industry as well. Let me get the global shapers in on the conversation. What would the expectation be if we were to achieve the aspiration of being an innovation nation? And innovation not just that comes to India's use, but also for being able to take that to the world. What do you believe needs to be done?
Thanks for having us, first of all, Shereen. Mr. Tyagarajan spoke about access to capital, and that's important. And you spoke about access to global markets. But like Mr. Rama was saying, I had met John Chambers at the India Entrepreneurship Summit a few years ago, and he mentioned what you said. But more than access to capital, I think it's access to patient capital, because you have to give startups the time to pivot, the time to test markets, the time to test products, and even learn from so corporations globally. And we see the Prime Minister today talk about amidst this crackdown on some of the corporates, we see him talk about understanding genuine failure. I think it's more important for understanding genuine failure for startups than it is for a corporation which has a lot more resources. Right. And I would even like to get Vishal's view on this. Like for example, business-friendly regulations that are coming in. If you look at the data protection bill, it was seen as a restrictive policy, which was very good for domestic players, but not maybe for global players. But now that it is being debated, it has been made, business-friendly. Some of the heavy restrictions have been moved out. So I'd like to see how it plays into for HP. But largely, I think corporations and startups collaborating a little more would be a good step forward.
Absolutely. Since the point of regulation has been brought up, and Vishal, let me get you and everybody else to comment on that as well. One of the key concerns, and this is again something that global CEOs are talking about, it's not just an India-specific issue, but over-regulation, and especially regulation for tech, whether it's going to be breaking down big tech or bringing in regulation that will even monitor what happens on social media and so on and so forth. This is what people are anxious about. Is over-regulation one of the chief concerns that you're worried about today?
The way I think about this topic, Shereen, is there is a place for regulation, right? I think if you leave things completely unregulated, in my opinion, it goes down the wrong path. So there is a place for regulation. It has to be done in the right way. But things around these are new areas, right? There are new areas that we are exploring, which is around privacy, around data privacy. I think there is a place for regulation, in my opinion. If I were to look forward 5 years, I think there will be more regulation. I mean, if you look at the financial crisis in 2007, there was more regulation put on financial institutions after that. Yeah. Was it a bad thing? I don't think it was a bad thing, right? But these are learning pains that we all have to go. We as an industry have to go through that as well.
Yes, balancing regulation and over-regulation is the challenge. But Mr. Mahapatra, since we're talking about regulation, one of the concerns is whether it's e-commerce, etc., that if there is heavy-handed regulation, that it may kill a sector that has the potential of being a job creator, that is a sunrise sector, and that is a sector that India needs to nurture and encourage. Do you fear that over-regulation may in fact hurt, and what's the government's view?
That depends on how you define regulation actually. This is the market is there. There are people in India, there are different concerns of different sets of people, and the government, both at the center and the state, have to ensure that there's a fair opportunity for all stakeholder coming under that sector. So whether the e-commerce or electricity companies, or for that matter, anyone who's dealing with any such sector, there is a scope for regulation. The government firmly believes that it is minimum government and maximum governance, which basically means the regulatory authorities also learn a lot in the process. Idea is never to over-regulate, idea is never to constrict. Idea is to ensure a fair play so that all sections of Indian society have a fair access to the sector from which they have to interact with.
Okay. So you're saying that is something that the government will be mindful of, and you don't foresee a heavy-handed approach to regulation that is expected for some of these sectors?
If you look at the history of regulations in India, it probably started with the power sector. You remember when I was working in Gujarat power sector in 2003-04, that is where we started the regulatory authorities to decide tariff. And since then, almost every state in India has a regulatory authority in power, including Government of India. Yeah. There's a lot of regulatory wisdom also which comes over the years, because the regulators, as they operate and they refine their decision-making process, they realize which are the limits to which it can set itself, where it should completely withdraw. So I think that is a learning process, and in many sectors we find the regulators are actually playing a constructive role.
Okay. The power sector, unfortunately, at this point in time, not a particularly great example.
Example of how it started.
How it started, I understand. But Mr. Rama Rao, one of the issues, and I go back to the point about legislation, and there is again talk that perhaps the centre will bring about legislation that will ensure that contractual obligations at the level of the state are honoured. And this, I would imagine, is in response to what is happening in your neighbouring state of Andhra Pradesh, where contracts for power companies are not being honoured. Do you believe that that is something that is necessary, warranted?
Two things. I mean, let me just go back to the question that you asked Secretary DPIIT about emerging, we talk about emerging technologies, we talk about emerging nations, we talk about how India is evolving, but I think we also ought to understand, as an emerging country, as a growing country, which is which is growing very fast, even our regulators and even our regulations are emerging and evolving. I think that's the point. I mean, if you look at states and if you also look at Government of India, every day is a learning for us. I pitch for life sciences investments into my state. So the last time I was discussing in the US with some medical devices enterprises, they were all worried about how price control would affect their business, with a high R&D cost, how would they survive, etc. So the fact is, Government of India, the state governments, we're all learning every single day. As we meet industry, as we meet the enterprises, we actually also tweak their inputs into our regulations, and we keep refining every so often. That's the first point. Now, going back to your question about contractual obligations and policy continuity, I think it's an absolute yes. I mean, without a question, without any hesitation, when there is a contractual obligation, because government is an institution, it does not matter, what happens every 5 years, but government is an institution, there are obligations that we sign up and we commit to, and we have to honor them without a question. But how do we ensure fair play also is, fair play in the sense of making sure that there wasn't any foul play in the past.
Right.
How do you ensure that balance is struck? I believe India also needs to start looking at more robust dispute redressal mechanisms. I think it's not just about ease of entry into a country, ease of entering into a business, but also exit if need be. How quickly can you exit? How quickly can you end a dispute? How quickly can there be a dispute redressal? I think this should be the focus of Government of India, rather than just passing a bland legislation saying you have to honor everything that you signed up for. I think you also have to figure out in the eventuality, because sometimes divorces happen. Disputes happen, and then when they happen, how do you make sure they happen amicably? How do you make sure they happen without the dirty linen being washed in public, etc., etc.? I think that should be the focus.
Yeah, I think you make a valid point there. Paresh, let me ask you, you're here learning from some of the people in this room, as well as from the YGL and the Global Shapers community. How do you see India and the kind of disruption that we're seeing, and what is it that you believe will get this momentum to get more robust?
Well, I completely agree with the Honorable Minister's point that we need 3 eyes today. And professionally, I work with Niti Aayog, where we do a lot of thinking on how can we take India and make it a $5 trillion economy as soon as possible, because we are supporting aspirations of 1 billion people in the country and 6 billion outside. But in addition to the 3 E's, I would say that we need to be more sustainable so that we are inclusive of the next generation as well. So that's one point I would like to bring to the table, that let's focus on building sustainable infrastructure, let's focus on building sustainable supply chains so that we are able to keep the momentum going.
And that's an important point that you make as well. Blake, you wanted to add to that about making sure that business practices are sustainable and that stakeholder capitalism is what we aspire for.
Well, absolutely, and sometimes people lose sight of the fact that advanced manufacturing increases the efficiency and therefore the sustainability and the conservation of scarce resources, and that's an important fundamental aspect of manufacturing across multiple industries. It's important to be efficient, to be competitive, but also for the next generation.
Yes. You're absolutely right. Tiger, you talked about the upskilling challenge and how that can be addressed using technology. Some of the other challenges that we have, whether it's healthcare, access to financial services, and so on and so forth, if you were to draw out a roadmap of how you would like to see India leverage technology to bridge these deficits, what would it look like?
So I'll start by saying, creating a positive narrative that technology actually solves these problems and doesn't come in the way of creating jobs. Technology creates jobs. Two, that actually it allows access to 1 billion people for these types of services. And then three, making the startup economy actually serve that group, highlighting what they are doing, creating an ecosystem that allows them to do it, including regulations. So the thing about regulations that we are big believers in is that if industry leaves the government to regulate, which they should and will, then it'll go in one direction only, which it will constrain. Regulations work really well when industry and government all get together early and actually debate. Because the idea of regulation is how do you make business sustainable in the long run? Yeah. If you don't regulate properly and if you allow only regulators to regulate, then it's unsustainable. So it goes back to capitalism left to its own devices with one single stakeholder actually doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. So much more consultation between industry and government before putting regulation in place. That is the need of the hour.
Yeah. And the other thing about talent is that India has always prided itself on science, math, technology. That talent, I would call that the left brain talent. Our belief is that the way technology is moving, it needs a combination of right and left brain. I don't think India has spent enough time in its education sector to actually, for example, foster creativity, problem-solving skills, communication skills, 20 people getting into the room and debating in order to come to a better answer. All 20 people may not have the same view of life.
We're good at debating, though. I mean, as a country, argumentative Indians, it's a book even, so that's not something that we have a problem with. But arriving at a solution, perhaps, is a different story.
I think the new generation may have lost it because it's become too left-brained. No, I think the way we think about the future is that talent consists of the STEM kind of people, but also the liberal arts kind of people. And then the idea of leaders is to bring that not so homogeneous group together to create value. I think government, industry, education, communities, etc. should work together on creating that other ecosystem.
Okay, let me get what's the 5-year plan? And Nikhil, share that with us so that gives us a sense of the kind of aspiration and the hunger that young people like you have.
Thank you. On the broking side, we're growing. We're planning to enter the American markets. We're taking our tech stack there and trying to compete with the American peers. We're also a NBFC. We're planning to do something around banking. We started a new asset management company recently, which is, I think, very innovative amongst not just the Indian peers, but global companies. It's an asset management company without any fund management fees. It's the only kind of company which only shares a carry. And tech-enabled, a lot of UI benefits and advantages which have come about by virtue of our expertise in this ecosystem. And I think these should keep us really busy over the next 5 years.
A listing soon?
No.
No?
No, I don't think so.
No? So that's not something that you're considering. 5-year plans, I'm going to get everyone to pitch in on that. And Mr. Arun Kumar, let me start by asking you, what do you see as the roadmap for the next 5 years for India?
Well, next 5 years, I would see a growth over the 5-year period. There may be some ups and downs as happens in every economy, but the demand situation in India is going to be very, very strong. As people graduate in the middle class and rise, it's going to be one of the largest demand creators, and that's going to drive innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment into the country.
Yeah, you're hoping that the current hiccup, we will be past that soon. CB, the big expectations over the next 5 years, where do you really see the big levers?
I think much of it has been mentioned, and I think one of the most important things that's coming out is the real story of India is going to be in the states of India. And so it's great to see a leader from the state really talking about how its state can really work in this ecosystem. And I think more and more what we will have to see is the engagement of the central government with the state governments to see on-the-ground issues, especially, you also talked about the regulatory issues. We don't want to see a repeat of Bangalore, where we had startups coming in, we had innovation hub created, and everyone moving away to Singapore after a point in time. We want to retain...
They haven't all moved. That's a bit of an exaggeration.
It's not all of them moved, but many of them moved. The startup community was looking at moving away after a start there. So what's required is a strong industry collaboration. We have, and that's what we are trying to do, is to see how there could be corporate connects to both in mentorship and incubation. Second, what's an important thing which is emerging is the university in academia and industry connect. And we're developing an industry, a very important industry framework, an innovation framework, along with the academia and the industry, to see how we can recognize, create the framework, and also recognize the best talents and encourage them to move on. And I think it's a great story ahead. The next 5 years is something which is an opportunity we shouldn't botch up by any means. And I think we'll have to be very carefully approaching it in terms of different types of partnership. The very important player is also the patent office over here. Yeah. And that's again another important level of collaboration. Both the Indian patent office and also industry's collaboration with other such organizations across the world to bring in the best practices. So if all of this is done, it's a great story ahead.
Yes, it certainly is an opportunity, and we need to be cautious about not squandering it. In fact, as I was coming in, I just read a report that IBM India has filed over 9,000 patents in 2019. That is the second highest number that IBM has done globally. So that's good news there. Mr. Mahapatra, there's been a lot of talk around the ease of doing business, but what about competitiveness? What are you going to do specifically to enhance competitiveness, which continues to be a big challenge and a big drag?
The ease of doing business, if you look at the indicators and our improvement that we made in the last 5 years, we are 63 now, and we have identified a lot of other specific activities in different sectors that we need to improve on to further improve our ranking globally. One is the questions of dispute resolutions. How early can we resolve disputes, which Honorable Minister talked about. If you look at the setting up of the designated commercial courts, the entire insolvency regime that we have established, the NCLTs that we are establishing, so that's one good way of resolving disputes. Secondly, the kind of competition that is happening among states, and where states ensure better quality infrastructure, the items for whether there's power, whether there's various other costs that the states charge on the industries, how due to this competitive instincts among various states to promote more industry in the states, those costs are coming down. And Government of India should also ensure more regulatory certainty, more investment certainties in terms of taxation policy, both direct and indirect.
Is this coming up as a concern? Does this continue to be a concern that investors are raising?
This continues as a concern in many levels of government, and I'm sure both central government and state governments are taking a lot of proactive steps in this regard to ensure there is a lot of certainty in the policies that we make, because based on those policies, the industries plan out their projections and set up the industries.
Okay. Mr. Ramarao, let me ask you, sir, you're very used to the fact that you work very closely with startups at T-Hub, which is the incubator set up by the Telangana government. So I'm going to ask you to make an elevator pitch for the state of Telangana. You get 1 minute to pitch to domestic and global investors.
Well, firstly, we are the topmost state with respect to ease of doing business in India. Secondly, if you look at the top 5 most valued technology companies in the world right now, all 5 of them, without an exception, have their second largest base outside of their headquarters in Hyderabad. And that marquee list includes Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon. In fact, Amazon's largest office in the world is in Hyderabad today. And I'm not even talking about IT or IT-enabled services. We are in 2020. I'm talking emerging technologies. I'm talking, the coolest of stuff that happens in the tech world is happening in Hyderabad. And let me also remind you, among all Indian states, among all Indian cities, Mercer has rated Hyderabad as a city with the best quality of living 5 years in a row now. And just yesterday, in fact, JLL Global has released a report. Among 130 cities globally, they've rated Hyderabad as the #1 city with respect to dynamism and momentum. So lots more, and we work very closely with Government of India, and I'm sure Government of India will work closely with us in bringing
and your time is up. Well done, sir. Let me quickly get in a word in from Mr. Jayesh Mehta as well, because he's going to ensure that everything that you just heard there from the Minister is executed on the ground. What next in terms of future policy to draw in large investments?
So just to supplement a couple of points which the Minister mentioned, and some of the other industry leaders also spoke, that what is very important is how these policies are translated into action. So in Telangana, we have created a very robust system which ensures that whatever is announced in the policy actually materializes in the ground. And if you look at two indices in our track record, one is that most of the investments which have been announced in the state, almost 75% of them have actually started producing results. They have materialized.
Yeah.
So the conversion ratio is very high.
Okay.
And the second important indicator is that how many reinvestments are happening. People who have invested once, are they investing the second time, third time?
So how many have happened?
I mean, in the last 5 years, my sense is that roughly 20% of the investments are by people who have already invested once. So that is also a very strong endorsement that the policies are actually working on the ground.
Okay. Since we are at Davos, I'm going to get a Davos veteran, Ajay Khanna, who's been around for how many years has it been, Ajay?
This is my 35th Davos.
35th Davos. So how has India at Davos changed over the last 35 years?
I can't give you an answer in 1 minute. But I think what has changed is reflected in this room. You have state government, center government, industry all working together. That has changed. There was a time when we used to do an India party, 40 people will show up. And Chandrajit
We have more than 40 people here today.
and Chandrajit will tell you at the India reception, he has to close the gates because we have 600 confirmations. So I think that's a reflection of India and Davos. And I'm very happy that over the last 30 years, CII and the Indian industry has worked together with the state governments. Today you have 4 states here, which was unheard of. So we're looking back, I can give you stories, but I think it's been a great journey for India, for CII, and to work with the World Economic Forum.
Absolutely, and we've been witness to many of the changes that have happened at CNBC TV 18 since we started our coverage here in Davos, and I can say with certainty that there has been a great degree of collaboration between industry, with state governments and with the central government trying to put together the India story to the world. Ladies and gentlemen, many, many thanks for joining us here for what has been an interesting conversation on India as an innovation and investment destination. Yes, there are challenges that need to be addressed. Yes, there are obstacles that need to be crossed. But if there is commitment, perseverance, and passion, I would imagine and I would hope that we will be able to execute what we've heard in this room. Our time is now, and there is no time to waste. I think that is the message that everyone here in this room needs to go back with. Thank you very much once again for joining us here on the CNBC TV 18 special, and thank you very much to the Confederation of Indian Industry for partnering with us. We'll take a quick break, but there's a lot more coming up here on our coverage from Davos 2020. For now, I hand it back to you.